Okay. Well, welcome everyone. We're here tonight for Coldharbour Institute's Applied Sustainability Winter Webinar Series. Thank you for joining. If you're just joining, feel free to type in the chat where you're zooming in from and where your interest lies. And I'll just mention, you can save questions for the end, or feel free to type them in the chat. We'll have some time about halfway through looking to, halfway through to see if there's any questions that come up. So Coldharbour Institute, today we're talking about the ecological restoration on the Coldharbour Ranch. This is part of our winter webinar series. We are a nonprofit in Gunnison, whose mission is to be a learning laboratory for regenerative living practices. So our winter webinar series is a 1-hour look into many different topics. Tonight, ecological restoration. But our next one will be with Anna Markey. She'll be talking about monitoring wildlife on the Coldharbour Ranch, and her talk will be diving deeper into the species richness on the ranch and future impacts. So you can register for that as well. As January 11th at 6 p.m. On our website down at the bottom, or I will put a link in the chat. But these events are all free, but we are implementing a gift economy. So if you feel like you gain something from this, and you are in a position to do so, we ask you to consider making a donation in an amount you feel is appropriate. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kathryn, who will be talking with you tonight about all of our ecological restoration and water resources.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, MJ. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Is everyone able to see that?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join in and listen today. I know this is a busy week for lots of you, especially with finals happening this week at Western. As MJ said, my name is Kathryn Bickley. I'm a master's in environmental management candidate here at Western Colorado University, as well as the Water Resources Fellow with the Coldharbour Institute. My background in particular is in environmental engineering, specifically in stormwater management and flood mitigation, utilizing nature-based design. For my master's project, I'm developing a stream restoration plan for the Coldharbour Institute. Today, I'll be speaking briefly about the state of water resources in our valley, providing an overview of the unique water resources found on the Coldharbour Ranch, and touching on some of the restoration potential we have here at Coldharbour. And just to reiterate, just to reiterate, I'll begin by providing some context and background for our conversation tonight. I'm going to speak briefly about current climate conditions, and I'll be focusing on Coldharbour's place in a larger ecosystem and network. I'll then touch on the importance of ecological restoration and provide some brief definitions and some graphics. I'll then be speaking about the wetlands and the specific reach of the Tamichi, both of which are encompassed within the Coldharbour property. I'll then move on to some of the specific restoration opportunities at Coldharbour and some of our goals that will come with implementing these restoration initiatives. I'll also be highlighting a completed restoration project that does share some similarities with Coldharbour. And lastly, I'm going to be speaking to the importance of long-term monitoring and also some opportunities for involvement at Coldharbour. And like MJ mentioned, I'll pause midway through for questions, and there'll also be time at the end for questions. To begin, the Tamichi Creek is a 71.8 mile long tributary of the Gunnison River. It originates north and west of Monarch Pass and flows to the southwest along the base of Monarch Mountain. As it continues on, the Tamichi itself has several tributaries, including Agate Creek, Long Beach Creek, and the Cochetope Creek, as well as Quartz Creek. And the confluence of the Cochetope and the Tamichi is located on the eastern end of the Coldharbour property near State Highway 114. And then from Coldharbour, the Tamichi Creek continues on westward, where it ultimately meets with the Gunnison River. As I mentioned, the Tamichi Creek eventually enters into the Gunnison River. The Gunnison Valley, where most of us are today, was originally formed by the Gunnison River millions of years ago, and the Gunnison River continues to sustain life here today by supporting agriculture, livestock operations, recreation, and by bringing revenue and providing a livelihood to many in our valley. The Gunnison River joins with the Colorado River near Grand Junction, and the Colorado River provides drinking water to much of the southwestern US before ultimately draining into the Gulf of Mexico. The Colorado is hugely important to the southwestern US through providing not only drinking water, but also supporting food production, offering opportunities for tourism and recreation, hydropower generation, and habitat for wildlife and migrating fowl. This is all really just to illustrate that even smaller scale stream and ecological restoration projects can have positive impacts and really large repercussions, not only for the communities they are located in, but for much larger regions as well. Responsible management of water and environmental resources is really important across the country, but it's especially important here in headwater communities in which our actions affect so many and so much downstream of us. Continuing to speak about the importance of stewardship, management of water resources is continuing to just become more and more important in the face of climate uncertainty. Here are a couple of graphics and kind of an explanatory table from the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is the most commonly used tool that measures drought conditions. I think as we're all familiar with, water is a really scarce and essential commodity in the arid West and in states like Colorado. As you can see here, currently the majority of the state is classified under severe to extreme drought status, and droughts are forecasted to become increasingly regular and severe. Droughts like these and a decrease in precipitation can have severe impacts on industries and organizations that depend on water to sustain their activities. As we continue to adapt to a changing climate, it's increasingly important that we responsibly steward and manage our finite water resources and also the areas they occupy, such as wetlands, wet meadows, rivers, and streams. As we now begin to move more into discussing ecological restoration on Coldharbour, I wanted to share a graphic from the Society for Ecological Restoration. It's a really great organization, and they have a couple of e-learning courses on their website that provide an introduction to some of these concepts. And if anyone was interested, I'd highly recommend checking them out. I really like this graphic in particular because I think in the environmental field, we really often hear words like reclamation, remediation, rehabilitation, and restoration. And these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, even though they actually have really distinct meanings. I think this continuum from SER really illustrates the concept of how ecological restoration fits in among similar terms. For example, I like to think of remediation kind of being on the lower end of this scale, where remediation might be a project, just designed to mitigate or clean up specific pollutants or chemicals from an ecosystem. And then as you kind of move up this continuum, you eventually arrive at this concept of ecological restoration. And this kind of highest standard here is fully recovering native ecosystems. And so to me, this is kind of trying to bring an ecosystem to its more natural, more self-sustaining state, something that it might exist in without the presence of degradation or disturbance. And I think that, depending on your project and a lot of factors, this might not be your goal, but I think if this is a standard you're able to work towards, it's a really great kind of end product for an ecosystem. I know many of us are aware of, both the function of wetlands as well as, all the benefits that can come from restoration and preservation. But I wanted to just kind of do a little overview of this. Specifically here in Colorado, less than 3% of the state is made up of wetlands, but wetlands are home to over 75% of biodiversity in the state. And they're also really important for a lot of different species, from wildlife to migrating waterfowl. Just to kind of go over some definitions here, wetlands are defined as being saturated with water either permanently or intermittently. And some of their many benefits include water quality, flood control and stream flow maintenance, stream bank stabilization and erosion control, wildlife habitat, specifically habitat for threatened and endangered species, ecosystem productivity, recreational opportunities, and water supply. And this is all to say that it's really exceptional that here at Coldharbour, 243 acres of the property are under an NRCS wetland conservation easement. And so I think that one of the things this really means is that any effort we can take to restore the wetlands we have has the potential to be so beneficial for the future, because this land will be here and will be protected for such a long time. The wetlands are protected in perpetuity. And so, the efforts we can take now will have really great repercussions into the future. As I move into talking, kind of more specifically about stream restoration, where my project is, I would like to kind of highlight the interactions and the co-benefits that do occur between streams and wetlands. A big one here is floodplain connectivity. In a channel like the Tamichi, during a flood event where the water in the channel exceeds bankful height, it does begin to interact with that floodplain. And wetlands are really great floodplains. There's a lot of water exchange that happens in a wetland. A common metaphor is thinking of a wetland as a sponge during really high magnitude flow events. During like flash floods and things similar to that, wetlands have a really great ability to absorb water that might exceed the carrying potential of a stream. And wetlands are really effective at taking that water and dispersing it and really slowly releasing it over time, kind of acting as like a natural detention pond. And this has a lot of benefits. It prevents really catastrophic flooding downstream. And also, like in the case of Coldharbour, having those wetlands is a great buffer for protecting some of the structures on the property, as well as the highway, which is nearby. And so wetlands are really great at kind of absorbing those excess flows during those really high magnitude events. And then kind of on the other side as well, during periods of low flow, streams can actually gain water through inflows of groundwater that are stored in wetlands. Typically in a wetland, the water table is going to be at the surface or right below. And so in a period of really low flow or drought, if a stream like the Tamichi is struggling to maintain its base flow, there can be inflows from an adjacent wetland that help to maintain that kind of minimum base flow level. And so it's really beneficial for a stream system to be adjacent to a wetland. I also touched briefly on the last slide about water quality, but wetlands are very efficient at filtering water and removing contaminants before they even enter a channel. There's actually a lot of like engineering and restoration projects that seek to create artificial wetlands to mimic the functions performed in naturally occurring wetlands. In addition to filtering out contaminants, wetlands also filter out excessive sediment by slowing the flow of water, causing suspended sediment to settle out before it's able to even enter a channel. Kind of the last one here is bank stabilization. Riparian vegetation that's commonly found in wetlands is super efficient at holding soil together and preventing erosion. And this is due to the fact that a lot of wetland vegetation tends to have really deep and robust root systems. Native sedges and shrubs are especially effective at this. Continuing to move through stream restoration, I'm now going to be discussing some of the characteristics of a well-functioning stream. As you think about like kind of what an ideal stream should look like, that's definitely going to be dictated quite a bit by the environment. There's so many different stream types, and some of those factors that'll influence what a stream ideally should look like will include the gradient, the bed material, and also the hydrograph for that stream, meaning where those flows are coming from. So there could be like a snowmelt driven hydrograph, or you could have a river whose flow regime is governed by dam releases, like periodic dam releases. And so all those factors are really going to influence what your stream kind of ideally or naturally would look like. It is really important though, especially if you're happening to work in like a degraded system, to have a really great reference stream that has as many characteristics as possible, because then when you're working to restore your stream, you can kind of have this example of the functionality you'd like to return your system to. I'm going to go ahead and go through this graphic now. This is the stream function pyramid taken from Dave Roskin, and I think it does a really great job of kind of explaining these many factors that go into a well-functioning stream. I also really like that it's presented as a pyramid, because I think that's a really accurate depiction. At the top here, you have this kind of biology level, which includes biodiversity. And in order to have a really functional stream with great biodiversity, it's really important that, your pH is sufficient and you don't have excess sediment, and that all these other factors are kind of in place. Starting at the base of the pyramid here, the foundation of any stream system is its hydrology. This relates to the transport of water from a surrounding watershed into a stream channel. Kind of this level is influenced by climate factors like precipitation, but it's also influenced a lot by land use. So thinking about how much water infiltrates into the ground before it actually reaches the channel, and thinking about the quantity of impervious cover that's included under your land use. So those are kind of all the factors when you're thinking about your watershed and the water actually traveling to the stream. Moving up the pyramid, next you have this hydraulics level, which concerns the transport of water once it's contained within a channel. This also relates to the ability of a channel to access its floodplain, like I was speaking about a few slides ago. Some of the metrics used to quantify hydraulics are bank height ratio and the entrenchment ratio, which both deal with a channel's ability to access its floodplain. Hydraulics also concerns things like flow dynamics, including channel velocity, and also things like the shear stress that's exerted on banks. This is all under the hydraulics category. Moving up to this middle layer here, you have geomorphology, and this has to do with like your bed forms in the channel and sediment aggregation and things like that. It also has to do with lateral stability, which is the degree to which a channel will meander back and forth. It's also sediment transport. And as I mentioned, kind of bed features like the percentage of riffles and pools, and also the depth variation that you get between your pools within a stream. This fourth level here is physiochemical, which takes into account parameters like dissolved oxygen, water temperature, pH, specific conductivity, and nutrient loads. And I am going to explain each of these parameters in a little more detail later in the slides. And lastly, at the top here, we have this biology level, which contains everything related to biodiversity. And this is fish to macroinvertebrates to algae, and we will be talking more about these as well later in the slides. Kind of leaving that pyramid, one thing I did want to highlight in particular is the importance of fish habitat. Especially here in the Gunnison Valley, we have people travel all over for fly fishing, and it's a big source of revenue in our valley. And fish habitat is directly related to the condition of a stream. And it's also one of the metrics that's most often targeted and sought to improve in stream restoration projects. And there's a lot of really well-tried practices we have for improving habitat. Freshwater fish in streams and rivers require a couple of specific things, including, certain levels of dissolved oxygen, a really consistent range of temperatures. That can be an issue if your stream is heating up quite a bit in the summer or during periods of warmer weather. It's also important that there's pretty consistent seasonal water levels. So as I mentioned, maintaining that base flow is really important because fish need, a certain number of pools and deep enough habitat. And if you're kind of dropping below your base flows, that is an issue. They also need certain features within a stream. Like I mentioned, the pools and the riffles. They also need a riparian zone that will provide both inputs of plant material as well as cover and shade. Fish populations are kind of susceptible to disturbances that can be caused by pollution, these unstable flow regimes I mentioned, and a lack of these features. I also want to talk about the importance of the Timichita wildlife. It supports not only aquatic species, but it's also a really important refuge for migrating birds such as the great blue heron. And it's also a water source for other wildlife that use the ranch for migration. I think it's really important when we're talking about stream restoration projects to kind of look outside of that one channel we're focusing on and think more broadly about these co-benefits. And so, outside of aquatic life, we do have this really diverse wildlife on the ranch that also utilizes the wetlands and the Tamichi Creek. I will go ahead and pause here. I'm about midway through just in case there are any questions that have come up. All right, I think I'll go ahead and continue. All right, so there are 3 restoration opportunities at Coldharbour that I'll be discussing in more detail. We've had several fellows work in this area, and for my project, I'll be continuing to move forwards and developing plans for potential restoration. The 3 kind of areas I'll be speaking to are bank erosion and the need for large woody debris, the issue of lateral migration and channelization, and lastly, some opportunities for increasing sinuosity. Bank erosion is a concern at several locations along the Tamichi. Banks lacking in vegetation are much more prone to erosion and they lack overall stability. The system is also lacking in large woody debris due to an absence in cottonwoods along the banks, which would typically provide this input in similar stream systems. Cottonwoods have somewhat short lifespans for trees. And so typically if there were cottonwoods present, this would be a regenerating cycle where you would have trees decomposing and falling into the stream and creating habitat and eventually flowing downstream and degrading. And so there's an opportunity here to kind of restore that cycle as well as kind of in the current time frame, input some of that lacking large woody debris. As I mentioned, some of the benefits that come from large woody debris are helping to slow high velocity flows, creating pools for fish and other aquatic life, and reducing the temperature of water by providing shading in some of these deeper pool areas. There's been a lot of really neat restoration projects that have used the input of woody debris, as well as other tree components such as root wads and even other kind of naturally found components like boulders to armor eroding banks while providing these really great co-benefits such as habitat creation. In my experience working as an engineer, I think it's really exciting to see these nature-based solutions. Kind of in the past century, if you were looking at a project like this where you had, severely eroding banks, one of the most commonly kind of employed practices would be riprap, which is typically really large, irregularly shaped pieces of concrete, which would be placed along a bank to armor it. And as we've had decades to kind of observe how these projects have done, we found that riprap can actually lead to more erosion. There's also really high transportation costs associated with it. And you're also introducing a foreign material into a stream, which in the case of riprap and concrete has the potential to alter pH and some other chemical metrics. And so I think nature-based solutions like this are really exciting where you're taking local materials that would be in the system anyway and kind of strategically placing them and utilizing them to reach your kind of desired outcomes. That being said, I do think that the deposition of large woody debris should also go hand in hand with revegetation efforts, such as planting cottonwood saplings in order to kind of restore this natural cycle that would exist in a stream system like this. Like much of the land in the Gunnison Valley, Coldharbour has had many uses throughout the years, and there's still topographical evidence of this today. The Tamichi Creek is constrained from natural evolution by features like Highway 50 to the north and an abandoned rail line and some dirt roads to the south. When a stream or river is not able to evolve and meander kind of how it naturally would, this can lead to channelization, which often results in erosion and a lack of floodplain connectivity. And just kind of as an example, in a valley like ours and a stream like the Tamichi, typically streams evolve over time. And so they have a natural meander to them. And there's usually kind of a balance that happens with sediment where they're able to expand and continue to meander. And you do run into some issues when you're constrained by something like a highway or something that prevents that kind of lateral migration from naturally occurring. We do have some really exciting opportunities to increase kind of the sinuosity or meander of the Tamichi on the property. As I mentioned on the path slide, a lot of healthy streams have some degree of meander. And this kind of sinuosity helps to naturally balance sediment transport. In a stream like this, you naturally have an erosional bank and you have a depositional bank. And so there's kind of this constant balance with sediment and with channel evolution. On On the Coldharbour property, we do have a few dewatered oxbows. This is an oxbow here, and these can be seen either on the ground by walking the property or in aerial imagery. There is an opportunity to re-wet these oxbows, which would increase channel meander. And these oxbows currently are still depressions in the ground from where the channel used to flow. And they do hold water during, events of precipitation, but we are still missing out on some of the benefits that would come from reconnection, such as restoring that sediment exchange process and the ability of aquatic life to access and utilize that additional habitat. Next, I'd like to kind of summarize some of our goals for restoration at Coldharbour. I've spoken a lot about habitat. We definitely have a lot of opportunities to increase and improve fish habitat, which is great for increasing revenue and recreation, but it's also great for the overall biodiversity of the Tumichi and of our greater ecosystem. There's also options to increase resiliency. Increasing the stability of a stream system helps promote resiliency to disturbances such as flooding or high flow events, and helps to increase resiliency in the face of fluctuating water levels and kind of these changing flow regimes. In terms of wetland inundation, some of our options like rewatering oxbows or even dissipating sections of higher flow will increase the amount of residence time of the water and will increase the inundation of wetlands, which will only serve to strengthen them. We also do have the opportunity to increase some of our water quality parameters, specifically with creating some of these deeper pools that can lower our water temperatures and increase our levels of dissolved oxygen. Next, I'd like to highlight a case study that's of a successful stream restoration project, and it does share some similarities with Coldharbour. This specific example is taken from the Society for Ecological Restoration project database. If anyone's interested in ecological restoration, it's a really neat tool. They have hundreds of projects from all over the world, and you're able to sort by like a disturbance of kind of what caused degradation or solutions that were used. And it's a really neat tool if anyone's interested. I'm going to be discussing the Little Snake River restoration project that occurred on the Three Forks Ranch here in Colorado. The ranch is located about 30 miles northwest of Steamboat Springs. I chose this project in particular because, unlike many restoration projects that have occurred on public lands and have been implemented by federal land agencies, this project was done on private land. It's actually the largest privately funded river restoration project completed in the US to date. To provide a little bit of background, the Three Forks Ranch first was ranched beginning in the 1870s. It was a typical kind of cattle ranch operation, and the land eventually became overused and degraded. Over time, there was really continuous grazing and haying operations. So the land wasn't really rested at all. And ultimately, this led to devegetation along the river and some subsequent erosion and lack of bank stability through the years. Over time, the river kind of continued to erode, and it became much wider and much more shallow. This led to an increase in water temperatures and a decrease in dissolved oxygen, as well as an increase in suspended sediment. All of these together kind of made the environment less hospitable to fish and other forms of aquatic life. The Three Forks Ranch, while being a working cattle ranch, also relies on revenue from people visiting to fly fish on the property, both when they first purchased the ranch and today. And so the kind of degradation of their stream system was affecting not only land health, but their ability to self-sustain and generate revenue as well. So the goals of this restoration project focus specifically on a 10.5 mile stretch of the river. And some of the goals included restoring stream bank stability, reducing bank erosion, reestablishing woody vegetation, and reestablishing a riparian buffer zone in general, as well as improving fish habitat and creating some natural wetlands. The methods for completing this restoration project can be broken down into 3 different categories. Those are channel modification, stream bank stabilization, and habitat improvement. Channel modification included both deepening and narrowing the channel in some locations. where it had been widened and shallowed over time. It also included restoring natural sinuosity of a couple of reaches that in the past had been artificially channelized, either for irrigation purposes or for development purposes, like putting in a road. They also focused a lot on deepening some of the existing pools in the river to help mitigate for the increase in water temperature and the decrease in dissolved oxygen. Moving on, the stream bank stabilization was achieved through a couple different methods. It was specific to kind of the individual bank and the issues that were occurring there. For the most severely eroded, steepest kind of sheer banks, they removed the bank entirely and replaced that area with a mixture of native cobble that was designed to prevent further erosion and to help dissipate the really high energy flows that were hitting those areas. They also took about 22,000 boulders from the surrounding area, and they placed these boulders really strategically throughout the river, and they formed a variety of different structures. You can find them all online. It's really fascinating. And these structures kind of served multiple purposes. For some of the banks that weren't as severely eroded, these structures helped to convey high water flows away from the banks. But in a lot of cases, they also created really crucial fish habitat. So they had these really neat co-benefits that went with them. The habitat was also further improved through the planting of mature willows on the outside of every single meander bend. These provided shading and also helped to reduce water temperature. They also used sod mats similarly to achieve stabilization. And kind of lastly, they created 75 acres of wetlands kind of directly surrounding the river. And that increased both the aquatic and terrestrial habitat. Kind of following this restoration project, they did some formal monitoring for 5 years after the project. And what they found in those initial 5 years were greater in-stream pool volume and an increase in deep water fish habitat. Overall, there were lower stream temperatures and increased dissolved oxygen levels. There was also an increase in riparian vegetation and channel shading due to replanting and improved grazing practices. There was also an increase in bank and overall system stability. And something I found really interesting was in 2005, when they were kind of nearing the end of this 5-year monitoring period, they had a year of really large magnitude flood events. And all the restored reaches on the property were able to maintain stability, and all these like structures they installed performed as they were designed to. One thing to note is I think it's really interesting that with a lot of these projects where you're working directly in a river, you expect some adjustments to be made just because the river is, an evolving and dynamic system. And so that's something that was taken into account with their plan, as they expected some, slight adjustments of these boulders and the placement of some of the structures they built. And there was adjustment, but it was well within kind of the range of what they were expecting. Kind of moving beyond that 5-year period, this project now has happened 20 years ago. And so I think it's neat to think about kind of some more of the repercussions that happened in the following 15 years. One of my favorite parts of this project was that after it was complete and the results were visible, a lot of the Three Forks Ranch neighbors downstream decided to do similar restoration projects on their respective reaches of the Little Snake River. And actually altogether another 16 miles of the river were restored. And the Three Forks Ranch ended up deciding to cover the planning costs for all of the rest of the river restoration. And they also helped their neighbors to apply for and obtain funding from the federal government to complete the restoration work. As of today, the Three Forks Ranch continues to be a working large-scale cattle ranch, as well as a destination for fly fishing. They also changed their grazing practices kind of as a result of some of this river restoration. They're now following a high-intensity, low-duration grazing kind of schedule, and they split the ranch into several distinct pastures used for planned grazing. And it's really neat. They have, I believe they have their yearlings graze 3 to 10 days in some of these riparian zones. And there's actually a lot of benefits that come from that grazing, such as kind of like revitalization of this revegetation and hoof action, aerating the soil. And so they've just have some really cool practices that they've implemented that have really complemented this restoration work really well. As they were kind of putting in these structures back in the early 2000s, they also created several ponds off of the main river that are kind of easy to separate from the main channel. And they did offer these to a couple of Colorado wildlife management agencies, and they're now being used as brood ponds for native Colorado River cutthroat trout. And so they're raising the trout off this river. And then because the river does have such an abundant trout population, those trout are actually being transported to other rivers in Colorado with less abundant populations. So kind of all in all, I really like this restoration project. Because, you know, you kind of have your channel and your stream and you kind of achieved all your objectives there, but then it also led to all of these really neat co-benefits. It directly led to other restoration projects. It helped the landowner to consider and implement some new grazing practices, and it contributed and continues to contribute to aiding a key native fish species. The last thing I'd like to talk about tonight is the importance of water quality monitoring. Monitoring is a really crucial component of any ecological or stream restoration project. Long-term monitoring is really important before a project just to, you know, kind of establish baselines and know what your conditions are prior to restoration. It's also very important afterwards because it helps to prove the efficacy of restoration methods. Currently, we do conduct water testing monthly on the Coldharbour Ranch. We have two different sites. One is on the Cochetope, just above the confluence with the Tamichi, and our other site is on the western end of the ranch on the Tamichi. We are a member of Riverwatch Colorado, which is a statewide citizen science supported river science initiative. Through Riverwatch, we test several different parameters. These are a lot of the parameters I've mentioned earlier in the presentation, so I'll just go through them briefly. One of the really exciting ones is benthic macroinvertebrates. There's a table of them right here. Benthic in particular means bottom dwelling, and these macroinvertebrates are really great indicators of water quality because they're not very mobile. They tend to stay in the same spot, and they also have a pretty long residence time of over a year in most cases, and they also have really distinct varying sensitivity to pollutants. And so typically, a stream unaffected by pollution will have species from each of these three groups. While on the other hand, if you have a really degraded stream, it'll likely only have this group 3 group, which is the most tolerant to pollution. And so when you sample for benthic macroinvertebrates, it's a really great indicator. And if you have a healthy stream, you're going to have a really great representation from each of these 3 groups. And so that's a really neat parameter. We also do test for pH, which is another really important metric. It can serve as an indicator of pollution or some other disturbance that's occurring. We also test for nutrients twice annually, once during our high flow and once during a low flow event. Nitrogen and phosphorus should naturally only be found in smaller quantities in a stream. And so if we have a sudden spike in nutrients, that could be an issue that there's a larger problem in the contributing watershed. We also test for dissolved oxygen, which is the amount of oxygen in aquatic environments that's accessible to fish, invertebrates, aquatic plants, and organisms. And we measure that on a monthly basis. And lastly, we do test for alkalinity and hardness. Alkalinity is a measure of the amount of calcium carbonate in our water. It's also commonly understood as water's ability to buffer against acidic changes in pH. So it's a really crucial component of our water. And also we have this hardness, which represents dissolved levels of minerals like calcium and magnesium, which are both really important for different fish functions. We are currently looking for volunteers to assist with Riverwatch at the ranch. This is a really great opportunity for students or community members interested in river science to gain some hands-on experience. We do provide all the training, waiters, and necessary supplies. And monitoring efforts like this will continue to support ecological restoration on the Coldharbour Ranch for years to come. If you're interested, please reach out to us at info@coldharborinstitute.org. That is all I have for you guys. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to attend.
Thank you, Kathryn. That was fantastic. If anyone has questions, feel free to type them into the chat or unmute yourself. If you want to show your face, you're welcome to. But we have about 15 minutes for questions. I have a question. You talked about the streams naturally meander. Is the de-wetting of an oxbow part of that evolution? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that looks like. And if we re-wet oxbows, is that pushing that meander, how a stream would naturally meander backwards?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's important to consider that these evolutionary processes for streams typically occur over pretty long periods of time. And so potentially over the course of several hundred years, you would have an oxbow dewater. But I think maybe in the case of kind of these like artificial constraints of highways or these rail lines, that dewatering could occur a little bit more quickly. And so I think that, kind of in a natural undisturbed stream system, that would be natural and you wouldn't really expect that reconnection. But I think when we're dealing with a stream with some kind of outside inputs, it can be beneficial to increase sinuosity in this way, even if it's maybe not how this kind of natural reference stream would behave, but it could have benefits. And I think it is something to consider and think about moving forwards.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has questions, feel free to jump in.
I have a quick question. So I thought that the case study you presented was really interesting, and it's cool to think about the similarities that it has with Coldharbour. It definitely seems like its starting point was a lot more degraded than Coldharbour is right now. But I was just wondering what you thought about the possibilities of kind of not just something happening on the Coldharbour property, but downstream from the and upstream even as well, so that it's more of connecting kind of those efforts on the Tamichi.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I do think there's some opportunities to kind of potentially bring in our downstream or upstream neighbors like they did in that case study. I think Coldharbour in particular is really well positioned to be a resource to others that are kind of maybe seeking to do other similar projects on their land. Coldharbour's mission is really about, being this laboratory and a learning ground for practices like this. And I think we're really well equipped to knowledge share, especially as we continue on in this project and continue to bring the community together, either like through webinars and formats like this, or even being able to bring people out to the ranch so they can kind of see firsthand the work that we're doing and kind of some of the benefits and outcomes that have come from that. So yeah, I really look forward to hopefully being able to share what we're working on and maybe bring other people in as well if they, have a degraded stream on their property and they're hoping to make some manageable improvements.
I have a quick question. So you might have, I tuned in late, I was in class, but you might have already mentioned this. I was curious about if there's beaver presence on Coldharbour, and if you guys have done any efforts to restore beaver habitat or put in any BDAs.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I guess that answer has multiple parts. Within the last month or two, we did have an MS ecology student put out some trail cams to look for beaver activity. And she wasn't able to locate any kind of on the locations her cameras were at, but I know that there has been historic beaver activity on the ranch. And we have had past fellows who have worked on kind of implementing some of these BDAs or beaver dam analogs. And so I think there's a lot of potential to work on that. I know other places in the valley, they've put in these analogs with the intent of reintroducing beavers or kind of attracting beavers back to those areas. And so I think that's a really exciting prospect for Coldharbour. And maybe MJ can speak more to kind of the history of that. I know we've had past fellows work on putting in some of those devices. And so, yeah, I think it's a really important area for restoration.
Cool, thanks. One more question, sorry, while I have you. I was curious if the Fish and Wildlife Service or CPW stocks Tamichi Creek with fish stocks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that they stock the Gunnison River, and I believe they may stock downstream of us at the state wildlife area. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that there's definitely portions of streams around us that are regularly stocked, and I'm not exactly sure about kind of upstream of us and the reach on Coldharbour.
Okay, thanks.
Kathryn, can you share some of the next steps that you're working on for Coldharbour's ecological restoration and what you're helping us move towards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're in a really unique position at Coldharbour because we've had so much work done on the ranch. And so we have this like wealth of data, and we have a lot of really neat aerial imagery, and we have a lot of on the ground surveying that's occurred. And so what I'm working on now is putting together a series of maps about kind of focusing on different areas and targets for restoration, and then also putting together some kind of specs for these different restoration options. And then kind of my ultimate product will be this scoping document, and I'll be including, these maps and these options. And I'd also like to work on kind of plans for monitoring after this project were to take place, getting bids from contractors in the valley, and then also hoping to put together some applications for funding from different sources that would kind of provide the funds to actually implement these projects here on the property.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions? We do have a few minutes left.
Hi, this is Larissa. I have a question. I was wondering, you mentioned that there's federal funding for restoration projects. Can you maybe detail just a little bit on how that works and how you can be qualified for the funding?
Yeah, I think that's honestly a pretty broad question. I think it's really great that there are a ton of different kind of avenues out there for pursuing funding like projects like this. I mentioned federal funding. I know there's funding available through the NRCS and other similar agencies. There's also funding available from organizations like Trout Unlimited for restoration projects. There's funding available at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And so I think the opportunities are definitely out there. I think it definitely takes some research and kind of like identifying maybe which grants or sources your project best fits. I think with some of these kind of call for proposals I've looked at, when an agency is funding a project, they're looking to reach certain metrics. So like, for example, they're really focused on improving water quality. So you'd kind of want to structure your funding request for the ways your project would improve water quality. And so hopefully that helps to answer your question. I think there's a ton of opportunities out there, kind of depending on your project, the organization you're applying with, and then kind of what the intended outcomes of your project are.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathryn. This was so informative, and really, I'm just really excited about all the potential at Coldharbour. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We will have a recording of this, so if you missed out on certain parts, you'll be able to go back and watch that. And yeah, have a great evening. Thank you, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.